Dallas, I don't feel too well.
This is episode 2 of Cat's Not War, part 2. And by the way, before I forget, I should mention that the script for this episode was actually made before I made the script for the other episode, so if it sounds like I am reiterating concepts, or if it sounds like I'm introducing concepts when I have already introduced them, that's why. But anyway, without further ado, here's Cat's Not War Part 2 by Patrick Higgins from the former Cat's Not War blog. Part 1. Financial capital is destructive capital. 1. The relationship between capital and imperialism, the various forms imperialism takes, and, ultimately, the effects capital tends to have on media discourse. By that last part, I mean the way in which capital compels people in high media to shut up about the relationship between capitalism and imperialism, and about the various forms imperialism takes. To start off, we once again catch a glimpse of the age-old connection between capitalism and imperialism. Actually, I think there's a book by Lenin literally called Capitalism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism, or something to that effect. Capitalism, as we know by now, is the impetus for imperialism, the jumping-off point to steal resources, back insurgencies, and rig elections. In reference to the writer's question of capital's interest in media discourse, I would say that, as we saw in the last article, the Intercept's and by extension Omidyar's ownership of finance capital assumes he will want to maintain a narrative that either passively absolves capital's imperialist hegemony by taking a stance of ignorance or simply pivoting and getting defensive and incoherent when it's pointed out by critics. Omidyar won't mediate objective discourse because, if he did, capital would flow away from his hands into the hands of a more favorable source, of which I'm sure there are many. Two. What could possibly connect the dismantling of Libya to the dismantling of Detroit? The answer to this question is mercifully simple. The same parties, the same investment banks, the same corporations, the same classes, and the same individuals profit from these destructions. If you watch my Let's Learn Public Health series, then you remember the ruination of Detroit's public health infrastructure due to their desperate bid to save the city by giving the reins over to a rather shady and unreliable private corporation. Said corporation could not execute the projects a normal health department would, and coupled with the size of Detroit's burden and their lack of funding, the whole thing went up in flames. Detroit's destruction and Libya's destruction, like the author says, have one thing in common above all else: being utterly demolished by the hands of financial capital because keeping an undesirable place in poverty is more profitable than extending resources to fix it. If an investment banker can systematically shovel a city under the dirt, why not do it to an entire nation? Three. A fleecing of Detroit occurred, and it dates at least back to 2005, when the mayor of the city, Kwame Kilpatrick, ran to the finances sector to fund the city's pension. These new creditors were, quote, wealthy investors, money market bonds, bond funds, insurance companies, banks, hedge funds, and debt traders, end quote. Banks spearheaded the investments, namely, quote, UBS AG, Bank of America Corp's Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan and Chase & Co., end quote. Together they, quote, enabled about $3.7 billion of bond issues to cover deficits, pension shortfalls, and debt payments since 2005, end quote. The total almost equaled, quote, the city's 2013 budget for police and fire protection. 2013, of course, marked the year when the state of Michigan sent a financial manager into Detroit to wipe out city costs on behalf of those very creditors. An already devastated city found itself cut into even smaller shreds. Not only did the Wall Street funders receive full payment, they saw major profits, $747 million worth, in fact. From the beginning, Detroit was essentially manipulated into giving themselves to the financial sector in huge, too-big-to-fall hedge funds, insurance companies, banks, and bond traders like Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Chase to be used as chew toys. We will read about an example that predates Detroit, a place in Michigan's predominantly black and very poor Benton Harbor. Four, the anatomy for the Detroit hit job was first implemented against Benton Harbor, a rural Michigan town that shares with Detroit the traits of being overwhelmingly poor and overwhelmingly black. Collapsed buildings doubling as health hazards, overgrown grasses, non-existent public transport. The city can't keep up with the blight. Some 40% of the streetlights are broken. Only about 1/3 of the city's ambulances run. In that vein, and to get an even clearer idea of the wreckage, take a look at another Michigan city, Highland Park. Like Detroit and Benton Harbor, and Flint, Highland Park is, again, overwhelmingly poor and overwhelmingly black. Now watch as the bulbs of its street lamps are plucked from their posts because the city was unable to pay its bills to the corporation DTE Energy doing the plucking. The state ordered workers from the electric company serving Highland Park, a suburb of Detroit, to take the light bulbs out of the streetlights as repayment, but also as a symbol to all its citizens. This is what you get when capital gets angry. Imagine that. All over the state of Michigan, state politicians are asking companies of all sorts to simply take away necessary parts of their quality of life and infrastructure. I have no doubt there have been and are companies in Michigan doing this with water, garbage collection, sewage treatment, ambulances, firefighters, and even police. Five, as many critics have observed, and what happened in Detroit was an exodus of not a general population, but specifically of the white population, which fled to the suburbs with its tax dollars, beginning in the 1940s and 1950s. It was fueled formally by racist policies like redlining. In 1941, a segregation wall was even built off 8 Mile Road to separate the white neighborhoods from the black ones, and informally by varied and violent configurations of discrimination and fear. Today, Detroit's population is still 83% black. Fun fact, I actually did a mini project on practices like white flight and redlining. White flight, and I will include a PDF for A Southern City with Northern Problems by Hunter S. Thompson in the description, is a phenomenon where white people, whether single or family units, will move en masse from a neighborhood if it starts to become more multiracial, especially if the neighborhood sees an increase in black people. The area will see its housing prices go down, but the white people will either A, get lots of money from other racist white investors and agents for their house and then leave, or B, areas in the city will be built by housing authorities, the projects, and then white flight will happen and word will spread that no white people should live there because, well, you get the idea. Ergo, the neighborhood becomes predominantly POC. But if a certain group of white landlords still remain to rent to black tenants, they will often act discriminatory towards them and not let them rent in certain apartments in a, quote, good area, unquote, pushing them to certain districts, a process called blockbusting. This is also true for estate agents. Redlining, a practice of demarcating certain areas to certain groups of people, usually by race but ethnicity too, can be political and as well and goes along with gerrymandering, which is when politicians arbitrarily map out certain locations that they choose to be their representative districts. Sometimes it's for votes, and sometimes it's because they want to appeal to and make policy for only certain kinds of people as their constituency. If there are millionaires making millions from the medical industry, from law, from whatever, they are undoubtedly investing in money markets or finance capital as established in markets in which money creates more money without actual commodities to mediate. What becomes clear is that the bourgeoisie that lives just north of Detroit has a direct economic interest, especially if they invest in bonds tied to Detroit, in the destruction of Detroit pensions and, furthermore, the destruction of Detroit itself. They have capital to invest, and while those working for the city of Detroit have mere wages to lose. If, say, doctors living in Bloomfield Hills invest in these bonds through a local stockbroker, they stand to gain from the further destruction of Detroit, just as they stand to gain from the further destruction of the Middle East if they invest in Boeing stock. Millionaires become millionaires not by creating new technology, but investing their capital into more capital. Look at anyone on Forbes' list. It's the easiest method of staying rich, especially if you know how to play the game or rig it in your favor, like winning against a house in Vegas. Investing in what the author writes as money markets, we can see that there's more than one way to skin a cat. If Detroit's bonds are tied to Detroit's destruction, which is being orchestrated on a systemic level by state politicians, the mayor of Detroit, electric companies, investment bankers, and more, then of course it would be easier to just pocket the money and split. Remember that Libya example? Well, let me tell you about the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, and some people include the prison system in there too, is a direct funneling of national finance capital into the war machine, into the Army, Navy, Air Force, etc. From there, that technology used to bomb Syria from companies like Halliburton, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing makes investors in these stocks a lot of money. So it goes like this. War tech companies make helicopters, planes, tanks, missiles, etc., give them to a defense department who then uses those tools to cause imperialist havoc. Then stocks go up, investors make money, imperialism keeps going, and the tech keeps coming, and the machine keeps chugging. If we understand the destruction of Libya, accelerated dramatically by a NATO bombing, to be an act of imperialism, then it becomes clear that the destruction of Detroit was an act of imperialism despite the fact that it exists within US borders. In fact, the city of Sirte, Muammar Gaddafi's hometown, pummeled by NATO bombs, aesthetically resembles large swaths of Detroit, a city that has been on the receiving end of zero bombs. While neglect and general rot has been at the heart of many of Detroit's physical woes, so has proactive dismantling, as seen in DTE's effort to steal city lights. So what does one call it when the hazmat men steal things used communally by a neighborhood on behalf of a corporation with state permission? Imperialism. It is called imperialism, especially because it is administered by the state and done for the benefit of corporate power, as well as an increase in the fictitious coffers of fictitious finance capital. There's this really great documentary I saw that talked about Gaddafi being co-opted into the US's imperialism schemes as this useful tool for propaganda, And unfortunately, at the time of recording this, I couldn't find it for the life of me. I saved it, but I have so many videos in that playlist that it would be really tedious to look for it. I'll try and find it, but if I don't find it, I'm sorry, guys. Anyway, the comparison of Sirte and Detroit should horrify many a reader and listener. How could the US practice imperialism in its own backyard? Simple. These are both what I like to call dirty wars for clean people. To elaborate, these don't have to be wars, just conflicts on any mass scale. Dirty in this case belies the tactics, not overt brutality, but underhanded, sneaky manipulation techniques of blood money, letting houses go into disrepair, burying people under medical debt, slashing their pensions, cutting off water supplies, all of this to make people miserable from behind the scenes. You engage in dirty tactics, but you are clean, or at least your hands are. Nobody publishes your name, nobody reveals your emails or call logs, and nobody knows which stocks you own and what you've done until you die. Your hands are clean. Imperialists are often clean in that they let the grunts go forth and spread the plague, whilst they just get money from more money. In both cases, corporate power is increasing beyond natural limits, and no products were created. Nobody went to the marketplace of ideas with a rationally made product and said, "Hey, look at my new invention, on sale now." Seven. If we're going to propose that the destruction of Detroit and Libya occurred on behalf of the same forces, it becomes necessary to ask what the interest finance held in the destruction of Libya. There were obvious classical colonial concerns, and by that I mean the extraction of resources such as oil. But there is also the expansion of money markets in which to invest superfluous capital. The capitalist class is indeed attempting to invest in larger, increasingly open money markets in places like Syria and Libya, and that can only happen once they are destabilized. In episode 1, we covered Parenti's rules of empire. At the end of the article, he stated that, in most cases, the empirical evidence we're presented with gives us enough information to conclude that the main reason imperialism is a mainstay in global politics is because of economic and socio-political reasons. The author of this piece, who I now know is Patrick Higgins, but at the time I did not know, seems to agree. However, the writer brings the addition of money markets into the equation. My assumption is that both Libya, Syria, and Detroit were not available to these investors beforehand, and that pummeling them into the ground was necessary to get them to bend enough that their destruction would yield more capital than their advancement. Eight. The US is the global hegemon, and yet it accounts for the less than half, only 44% of the global bond market volume. Pretty much all the rest goes to Europe. You'll notice that the US and Europe form a geopolitical bloc on most major issues against the country in which the investors of the US and Europe seek to expand their money markets. The country that necessitates destabilization campaigns of its key allies, such as Libya and Syria. That country is Russia, which, with fellow smaller holdout states, is sometimes referred to as the Global South. The US requires imperialist collaboration between itself and Europe to stay in the bond market game. Ever wonder why they're allies in NATO, or why they're usually voting together on UN issues? Yeah, this is why. And on an extremely pertinent topic as of late, Russia, since the revolution of 1917, over 100 years ago, has been the undercurrent enemy of US foreign policy and global hegemony because Russia went, and still does, go almost toe-to-toe with them on the global imperialist stage as another intrusive foreign power with their hands in many pies. Case in point, Ukraine. Russia has allied itself with all the countries the US can't stand: Cuba, China, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Libya, etc., because it needs to maintain an economic foothold in these countries so that the US cannot siphon off the money capital flow. It's all one big chess match. Curiously, Russia is mentioned to be a part of the Global South by the writer, but I don't usually see them mentioned as such. But on this note, I've mentioned the Global South as an entity which is bled dry continuously by imperialists of all stripes and is the victim of ballistic destabilization and third worldization on the regular. It's no surprise to me, then, that Russia is on this list, at least for certain periods of time, like de-Sovietization. Nine. Quote, the article from 2012 concerns at least one Russian official predicting foreign ownership of ruble debt, which was at 3%, will grow to around 25%, but that he didn't want it to go much beyond that, end quote. That number has already increased, and it has increased concomitantly with the slow-burning destruction of Russian allies Libya and Syria. Like all liberalization policies of local markets, some within Russia will become, and are undoubtedly becoming, wealthier from them. This certainly happened when the markets of its allies Libya and Syria underwent similar reforms. But the reason Russia resists total overhaul and does it with whatever military resources it and its allies have. Watch this play out in Ukraine now, by the way, where Putin utters, "Oh no, you don't, not again," is that the process of liberalization as demanded by Western capital will not stop until it is entirely of the Russian economy, ends up subsumed by, and dependent on Western capital. It can be said that Russia exerts some military influence over politics in Syria and Ukraine. It must also be said that it shares with Syria and Ukraine the reality of being a target of Western finance capital. We can see that, through conquest, a sort of ownership is acquired. As debt, which is a form of imperialism as we learned, goes up, so too does ownership of a country to foreign investors. War is a great way to barge in on a bond market, and it's also a great way to capitulate someone into selling you their products and services at a more nominal price. As Syria and Libya fell on hard times, so too did their unwillingness to let profiteers into their markets crumble. Market liberalization will do that to you. For reference, this article was written when Russia invaded and captured Crimea in 2014. Russia and Putin are trying to swallow Ukraine whole and capture their economy so they have unlimited financial capital resources. Here a manufacturer sells itself based on its relevance to meeting the challenges of instability presented by the Arab Spring. Now consider that US weapons introduced instability, sent to rebel forces in Libya and Syria by both the US directly and by Gulf allies, to which the US sold weapons, and you have a pretty clear picture of the circular logic of the war industry. Advertising as it relates to sociology and political economy is a topic I've been fascinated by for a year now. Framing a tool for use as a tool for liberation in assisting with the struggles of an authentic grassroots movements is a very sneaky way to profit off the backs of the oppressed while oppressing them even more. Parasitic and vulture-like, you could even call it vulture culture in a strange way. In my eyes, vulture culture is when someone gains something through the tragic scraps of another's misery. Selling weapons to government-backed insurgencies and then reaping the money and resources from a whole population's turmoil? That's vulture culture at its finest. (11) With increased state spending comes an increased state share of total GDP. This indicates that the fascist state does more than simply rescue capital in moments of extreme crisis, as the TARP program did. The state also actively absorbs superfluous capital. This, in the final analysis, the fascist state serves the exact same role as the imperialism it advances. As a closer to the second part of Cats Not War, we can conclude succinctly that fascist state spending is the mode and vehicle for capitalist aggression, the driver for the out-of-control car. Any attempt to corral it just collapses the economy of one country and several others intertwined with it. So that was Cats Not War, Part 2. Next episode will be the concluding episode of Cats Not War, Part 3. I hope you'll join me for it. Till next time, see you later!
8, 2, 7, 5. 3, 8, 2, 7, 7.